In the heart of Hollywood, where dreams are sold by the minute and everyone seems to be shouting just to be heard, there was a man who chose to stay quiet. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he believed some things were meant to be carried, not shared. His name was known to millions, his face plastered on posters and magazine covers, yet few truly understood the weight he carried behind that calm, almost gentle expression. It was the early 1990s. The world saw a laid-back guy with tousled dark hair and a slow smile, famous for playing a time-traveling slacker in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. To fans, he was the embodiment of chill, someone who'd rather say whoa than complain. But off-screen, life hadn't been excellent at all. His childhood had been anything but stable. His father, a man he barely knew, had walked out when he was just a boy. Letters stopped coming. Calls never happened. That kind of absence doesn't just leave a gap. It leaves a question that echoes for years. Was I not enough? He never talked about it in interviews, never blamed anyone. Instead, he moved, first from Beirut to New York, then to Toronto, bouncing between schools, languages, and identities. By the time he was a teenager, he'd already learned how to disappear in a crowd, how to listen more than speak, how to read a room before saying a word. Acting wasn't just a career choice, it became a refuge. On stage or in front of a camera, he could be someone else, someone whole, someone wanted, someone with a clear place in the world. When his first big break came, it wasn't with fanfare. It was quiet, almost accidental. A casting director saw something in him, not just good looks, but a stillness, a depth that most young actors tried to shout, but he simply held inside. He took small roles at first, working odd jobs between auditions, washing dishes, driving a limo, even selling Christmas trees on the side of the road. He didn't complain about the grind. In fact, he seemed to prefer it. There was dignity in showing up, in doing the work without needing applause. As fame grew, so did the expectations. People wanted to know everything about him, his favorite food, his dating life, his thoughts on the universe. But he gave only what was necessary. He'd smile, answer politely, then retreat. Not out of arrogance, but out of instinct. He'd learned early that sharing your pain with the wrong person, or worse, with no one in particular, could turn your grief into gossip, your vulnerability into content. And he refused to let his inner world become public property. This wasn't stoicism for show. It was survival. He'd seen how quickly sympathy could turn into spectacle, how a tear in an interview could become a meme before the credits rolled. So he kept his struggles close, like stones in his pocket, felt, but never displayed. When asked about his past, he'd say things like, "I'm still figuring it out," or "We all have our stuff." Simple, honest. No drama, no victimhood, just truth wrapped in humility. What people didn't realize was that his silence wasn't emptiness, it was full of effort. Every morning he made a choice to show up as someone kind, even when he didn't feel like it. To thank the crew members, remember the coffee order of the makeup artist, hold the door for the intern. These weren't grand gestures. They were quiet acts of connection in a town that often treated people as stepping stones. He read constantly. Not just scripts, but philosophy, poetry, history. He filled notebooks with thoughts he'd never publish. He practiced guitar alone in his apartment, not to become a rock star, but because music helped him breathe. He ran for miles through empty streets at dawn, not for fitness ads, but to outrun the ghosts that sometimes whispered in the dark. And through it all, he never posted his pain online. There were no late-night rants, no cryptic social media captions begging for interpretation. In an era before Instagram confessions and viral trauma dumps, he already understood something many still struggle with today. Telling everyone your problems doesn't make them lighter. Sometimes it just spreads the weight to people who can't carry it, and leaves you feeling even more exposed. He believed in action over announcement. If he was hurting, he'd work. If he felt lost, he'd learn. If he missed someone, he'd write a letter he might never send. His healing wasn't performative. It happened in the unseen hours, in the choices no one filmed or quoted. This approach confused some. Why doesn't he open up more? Critics would ask. He's so reserved. It's weird. But those who knew him well saw the truth. His reserve wasn't coldness. It was respect. For himself, for others, for the sacred space between private pain and public life. He understood that not every wound needs an audience to heal. Some just need time, patience, and the quiet courage to keep going, and go he did. From indie films to blockbusters, from stage plays to motorcycle shops, yes, he co-founded one later just because he loved bikes. He kept moving, not to escape his past, but to build something meaningful on top of it. He never claimed to have it all figured out. In fact, he often said the opposite. I'm just trying to be a good human. That phrase, a good human, meant more than kindness. It meant responsibility. It meant not dumping your emotional baggage on strangers, not using your platform to fish for pity, not turning your life into a cautionary tale for clicks. It meant carrying your load with grace even when it felt unbearable. There's a moment rarely talked about that captures this perfectly. During the filming of a small drama in the mid-90s, a young crew member broke down between takes, overwhelmed by family issues, financial stress, the pressure of just surviving an L.A. Most stars would have offered a quick hang in there and walked off. But he stayed. He didn't give a speech, didn't promise to fix anything. He just sat with the person for 20 minutes, listened, then quietly paid their rent for the next 2 months, without telling a soul. The crew member only found out years later, from a production assistant who'd seen the check. That was his way. Not loud, not viral, just human. By the time The Matrix came around, the world was ready to crown him a superstar. But he hadn't changed. The same man who once slept on a friend's couch now owned homes, yet still took the subway when he could. The same man who'd lost his father now treated every stranger like family. Fame didn't inflate him, it grounded him further. Because he knew better than anyone. The higher you rise, the more important it is to stay real, and through it all, he held to one unspoken rule. Don't tell others your problems. Not because you should suffer in silence, but because your problems are yours to solve. Not to broadcast, not to burden others with, not to trade for attention. Share when it helps, speak when it heals, but never confuse venting with healing. Never mistake an audience for a therapist. This wasn't about bottling up emotions. It was about choosing wisely who gets access to your heart. He had close friends, real ones, who knew his pain. But he didn't air it on talk shows or turn his grief into a brand. He protected his peace like a secret garden, tended it daily, let only a few inside, and never let the outside world trample it for entertainment. In a culture that increasingly rewards oversharing, his restraint became radical. While others built careers on trauma narratives, he built his on presence, on showing up fully, quietly, consistently. And in doing so, he showed something rare. That strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the man who carries his sorrow without letting it spill onto others. The one who listens more than he speaks. The one who helps without needing credit. Years later, when asked in a rare interview what advice he'd give his younger self, he paused, then said softly, "Be gentle with yourself. And don't feel like you have to explain your pain to prove it's real." That line, simple, unadorned, was the closest he ever came to a public manifesto. And it echoed everything he'd lived by. So when people now quote Keanu Reeves' motivation speeches, they're often referring to words he never actually said. But the spirit behind them? That's real. It's in the way he lives. In the way he carries his burdens without making them everyone else's problem. In the quiet dignity of a man who believes your struggles don't need an audience to matter. They just need your courage to face them. And that, more than any viral quote, is the real lesson. Not to suffer alone, but to handle your life with care, like a fragile thing worth protecting, not a story worth selling. Because in the end, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to tell the world your problems. It's to solve them, grow through them, and become someone who can help others do the same, without ever needing to say a word. Fame arrived like a storm, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. One moment, he was just another actor trying to find his footing in a city that chewed people up and spat them out. The next, he was everywhere. Posters on buses, interviews on late-night TV, strangers stopping him on the street just to say, "Whoa." The Matrix hadn't just made him famous. It had turned him into a symbol. People saw Neo, the chosen one, and assumed the man behind the sunglasses must be living a perfect life. But the truth was far heavier. Behind the sleek black coat and slow-motion bullet dodges, his world was quietly falling apart. It started with joy, the kind that makes your chest ache with hope. He was going to be a father. The woman he loved was expecting their baby girl. For the first time in years, maybe ever, he let himself imagine a future that wasn't just about work or survival, but about bedtime stories, tiny shoes, and Sunday mornings with pancakes. He bought a crib, read parenting books, practiced holding a stuffed animal like it was real. He wasn't just preparing, he was believing. Then in the cruelest twist life can deliver, their daughter was born too soon. She lived for only 2 days. 2 days of holding her fragile body, whispering promises she'd never hear, and feeling a love so deep it carved a hole in his soul. There were no photos released, no public statements beyond a quiet acknowledgement. He didn't post about it, didn't write a tribute for the cameras. He simply disappeared for a while, not to escape, but to grieve in the only way he knew how, privately, fully, without an audience. The world moved on quickly. Headlines shifted, new movies came out, but for him, time had fractured. He returned to work not because he was over it, but because work was familiar ground. On set, he was the same, polite, focused, always early. No one would have guessed the storm inside. He didn't snap at crew members, didn't cancel scenes, didn't demand special treatment. If anything, he became more gentle, as if he now understood how thin the line is between joy and loss. Less than 2 years later, the ground gave way again. The woman he loved, the mother of his child, was gone. A car accident, sudden and final. Just like that, both anchors of his new beginning were ripped away. This time, the grief wasn't just sorrow. It was disbelief, rage, guilt, and a silence so thick it felt like drowning. Still, he said almost nothing publicly. No tearful interviews, no social media outpourings. He attended the funeral, stood by the grave, and then went back to his routine. People called him stoic. Some said he was emotionless. But those who were near him saw the truth. He wasn't numb. He was protecting what little was left of his heart. He knew that if he started talking about his pain in public, it would become a performance. And his love for them? That wasn't a performance. It was sacred. So he kept it close, like a flame he shielded from the wind. He didn't stop living, though. That's the part people often miss. Grief didn't paralyze him. It changed how he moved through the world. He became even more present with the people around him. If a co-star seemed down, he'd quietly ask, "You okay?" and really listen. If a crew member mentioned a sick parent, he'd remember and check in weeks later. He didn't offer grand solutions, just presence, just care, because he now knew how much it meant to feel seen. Even when you're falling apart inside. During the filming of The Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions, he was earning millions, enough to live in luxury for generations. But instead of buying yachts or throwing parties, he did something few expected. He gave away a huge chunk of his salary, not for publicity, not for tax breaks. He simply walked into the production office and said, "The crew worked harder than anyone. They deserve a share." He handed out checks to special effects artists, camera operators, costume designers, people who'd spent years helping bring his character to life. Some received bonuses larger than their annual salary. When asked why, he just shrugged. "They made it happen. I just showed up." That act wasn't charity. It was gratitude. And it came from a place of deep understanding that no one succeeds alone, and that real wealth isn't in bank accounts. It's in how you treat people when no one's watching. Offset, he avoided the Hollywood scene. No red carpets unless absolutely necessary. No late-night clubbing. He'd often be found alone at a small diner, eating a simple meal or walking through a park, hands in his pockets, lost in thought. Paparazzi would snap photos and the tabloids would spin stories. Keanu Reeves, lonely and lost, but they never got it right. He wasn't lonely. He was choosing solitude over noise. He'd rather sit with his thoughts than pretend to enjoy a room full of strangers talking about nothing. He also started spending more time with animals, dogs especially. He'd visit shelters, not to adopt for the cameras but just to sit with them, pet them, give them a moment of calm. He once told a shelter worker, "They don't ask for your story. They just want to know you're kind." That line stuck with her for years. It was clear he saw himself in them, beings who'd been hurt, but still wagged their tails when someone showed up with patience and love. Through all this, he never played the victim. He didn't blame the universe or demand answers. He accepted that life could be beautiful and brutal in the same breath. And instead of shouting about the injustice of it all, he chose to respond with quiet action. He funded medical research, not with press releases but through anonymous donations. He supported friends going through hard times not by giving advice but by showing up with groceries, or just sitting in silence with them. There's a story from this time that few know. A young actor on a film set was struggling, new to town, broke, and recently lost a sibling. One evening, after wrapping a long day, this actor found an envelope slipped under his trailer door. Inside was a note that read, "Keep going, you matter," and enough cash to cover 3 months' rent. No name, no return address. But the handwriting? Familiar. Years later, the actor confirmed it was him. When asked why he did it, the reply was simple. "Because someone once did it for me. Not with money, with kindness. And that kept me going. That was his way. He paid forward the grace he'd needed but rarely received. And through it all, he never used his pain as a weapon or a shield. He didn't cancel projects, lash out at fans, or retreat into bitterness. He showed up tired, yes, but still trying. Still kind, still human. People often wonder how he kept going. The answer wasn't in grand philosophies or motivational quotes. It was in small daily choices. Choosing to get out of bed. Choosing to say thank you to the janitor. Choosing to listen instead of speak. Choosing to believe that even after the worst loss, there's still good worth protecting in the world. He once said in a rare interview, "Grief doesn't end. It changes shape." That line wasn't poetic fluff, it was lived truth. Some days the grief was a heavy coat he wore all day. Other days it was a whisper in the background like distant thunder. But he never let it drown out his humanity. If anything, it deepened it. And that's what made him different. In a world where pain is often turned into content, where people monetize their trauma, sell their breakdowns, and build brands on brokenness, he refused. He honored his losses by living well, not by broadcasting them. He proved that you can be shattered and still be strong, that you can carry sorrow and still offer kindness, that you don't need to tell the world your problems to deserve peace. By the time the Matrix sequels wrapped, he'd become more than an actor. He'd become a quiet example of how to endure without exploding, how to heal without performing, and how to lead with compassion even when your own heart is bruised. And though the cameras followed him everywhere, they never captured the real story. The one that happened in the quiet moments, in the choices no one saw, in the love he gave without expecting anything back. That story wasn't for headlines. It was for the people whose lives he touched simply by being steady in a world that's always shaking. So when people now talk about Keanu Reeves' motivation, they're not quoting a speech. They're pointing to a life that said through action, not words, "Your pain is yours. Carry it with dignity. Don't dump it on others. And never let it steal your kindness. Because in the end, how you treat people when you're hurting, that's the truest measure of who you are." And he passed that test again and again without ever needing to say a word. While the world buzzed with headlines and rumors, he kept walking his own path, quietly, steadily, without fanfare. By the early 2000s, most people thought they knew him. The mysterious Hollywood star who never smiled for paparazzi, who gave short answers in interviews, who seemed to float through fame like a ghost. But those who crossed his path in real life saw something entirely different. They saw a man who remembered your name after one meeting, who asked how your mom was doing after you'd mentioned she was sick months ago, who would give you his coat if it looked like you were cold. He didn't do these things to be noticed. In fact, he went out of his way not to be. There were no Instagram stories of him handing out meals to the homeless. No viral clips of him comforting a crying stranger. He simply lived by a quiet rule: if you can help, help, and don't make a show of it. One winter evening in downtown Los Angeles, a young woman working the night shift at a gas station was wiping down the counter when he walked in. She recognized him instantly but said nothing, just nodded politely. He bought a bottle of water, paid in cash, and lingered for a moment. "Rough night?" he asked gently. She shrugged, tired, and admitted she'd just gotten off a double shift and still had to catch 2 buses home. Without a word, he stepped outside, flagged down a cab, paid the driver for a ride all the way to her apartment, and handed her the receipt. "Get some rest," he said before walking off into the night. She cried in the back seat, not because of the ride, but because someone had seen her, really seen her, in a world that usually looked right through people like her. Stories like this began to surface, not from him, but from the people whose lives he'd brushed against. A bike mechanic once recalled how he showed up at a small shop, not as a celebrity, but as a customer who loved motorcycles. He spent hours talking shop, asking questions, listening more than speaking. When the owner mentioned he was struggling to keep the business afloat, he didn't offer empty encouragement. A week later, an anonymous investor wired enough money to cover 6 months of rent. The owner only found out it was him years later, when they ran into each other at a charity event, and he quietly confirmed it with a nod. He had a deep love for motorcycles, not for the image, but for the mechanics, the freedom, the focus it required. He even co-founded a custom bike company not to make money, but because he genuinely loved building things with his hands. At the shop, he wasn't the star. He was just another guy in grease-stained jeans, tightening bolts and testing engines. Co-workers said he never acted like he was above anyone. If anything, he worked harder than most, arriving early, staying late, always willing to learn. This hands-on approach extended to everything he did. When he donated to cancer research, something he did regularly after losing loved ones to illness, he didn't just write a check and pose for photos. He visited labs, asked scientists about their challenges, and quietly funded equipment they couldn't afford. He never asked for credit. In fact, many of the researchers didn't even know who he was until years later. To them, he was just a generous donor who cared. And then there were the little things, the kind that never make the news but change someone's day. Like the time he was spotted on the subway, not in a private car or surrounded by security, but sitting among regular commuters. A teenager nervously approached, trembling as he asked for a photo. Instead of a quick snap and goodbye, he put his arm around the kid, asked about his dreams, and told him, "Don't let fear decide your path." The boy later said that 5-minute conversation kept him from dropping out of school, or the time he showed up at a children's hospital, not for a scheduled visit, but because he'd heard about a young fan undergoing treatment. He stayed for hours, not just signing autographs, but playing board games, reading stories, and making silly faces to get the kids laughing. Nurses said he refused to leave until every child had smiled at least once. And when he left, he slipped an envelope to the head nurse, enough to cover toys and books for the ward for the rest of the year. What made all this remarkable wasn't the scale of his generosity, it was the consistency. He didn't do good deeds when cameras were around. He did them when no one was watching, and he never spoke about them afterward. In a world where kindness is often used as content, where people film themselves helping others just to get likes, he treated compassion like breathing, natural, necessary, and not worth announcing. This wasn't performative humility. It was deeply rooted in how he saw the world. He believed that everyone was fighting something invisible, that the cashier, the bus driver, the intern on set, they all had burdens they carried silently. And if you had the means to lighten someone's load even just a little, it wasn't charity. It was basic human decency. He also understood something many miss. Real generosity isn't about giving what's easy. It's about giving your attention, your time, your presence. Anyone can donate money. But to sit with someone in their pain, to listen without trying to fix it, to remember their story weeks later, that's rare. And that's what he offered again and again. There's a story from a film set in Canada. It was freezing, and the crew had been working 14-hour days in the snow. Morale was low. One morning, everyone arrived to find hot meals waiting. Real food, not just craft services sandwiches, and handwritten thank you notes on every chair. No one knew who'd arranged it. Then they saw him walking through, carrying trays, making sure everyone got seconds. He hadn't told the producers. He'd just done it himself, quietly, before sunrise. When asked later why he went to such lengths, he simply said, "They're the reason the movie exists. Without them, I'm just a guy talking to a wall." That mindset, seeing others as essential, not expendable, was woven into everything he did. He treated assistants like equals, remembered the names of security guards, and always said please and thank you, even when exhausted. In an industry known for ego and entitlement, his humility stood out not because it was loud, but because it was constant. And yet, he never acted like he was special for being kind. To him, it wasn't extraordinary. It was ordinary humanity. "We're all just people," he once said in a rare moment of reflection. "Some have more, some have less. But we all need the same things: to be seen, to be treated with respect, to know we're not alone." This belief shaped how he moved through the world. He didn't separate famous life from real life. He lived one life, grounded, connected, present. He shopped at regular grocery stores, rode public transit when he could, sat alone in parks watching people, listening to the rhythm of everyday life. He didn't hide from the world. He immersed himself in it, and in doing so he became a quiet antidote to the noise of modern fame. While others built empires on self-promotion, he built a life on quiet service. While influencers turned their struggles into content, he turned his pain into patience. While the world shouted for attention, he whispered kindness, and somehow it echoed louder. People often wonder why he never married again or had more children after his losses. He never gave a clear answer, and that's okay. Some wounds don't need explaining. But those close to him say he never closed his heart. He just chose to love differently, not through grand declarations, but through daily acts of care. He became a brother, a friend, a mentor, a neighbor. He expanded his idea of family beyond blood or marriage and found connection in the small, honest moments. He also found peace in creation, whether it was building a motorcycle from scratch, writing poetry no one would read, or rehearsing a scene until it felt true. He poured himself into making things that mattered, not things that sold. His art wasn't about fame. It was about meaning, and through it all he held to that unspoken code. Don't tell others your problems. Solve them, grow through them, and use what you've learned to help others carry theirs. Not by preaching, but by living. So when strangers now share stories online of him giving up his seat, paying for someone's groceries, or just offering a kind word at the right moment, they're not chasing clout. They're bearing witness to a life lived with integrity. A life that says, without saying it, you don't need an audience to be good. You just need to show up, be human, and do what's right, even when no one's watching. And in a world that often confuses visibility with value, that might be the most radical thing of all. Most people expect wisdom to come with a spotlight, delivered from a stage, wrapped in perfect sentences backed by music and applause. But real wisdom often arrives quietly, in the spaces between words, in the way someone lives when no one's watching. And for him, the lessons of a lifetime weren't taught in speeches. They were forged in loss, shaped by silence, and lived out in simple daily choices. He never claimed to have answers. In fact, he often said the opposite. "I'm just trying to figure it out, like everyone else." But there was something in the way he carried himself, calm without being cold, present without being pushy, that made people lean in. Not because he demanded attention, but because he offered something rare: honesty without performance. In the rare interviews he gave, he never offered the usual Hollywood fluff. No follow your dreams cliches. No rehearsed sound bites. Instead, he spoke in fragments, short, raw truths that felt more like confessions than quotes. When asked about grief, he didn't say it gets better. He said, "Grief changes shape, but it never ends." That line wasn't poetic for effect. It was lived. He knew grief wasn't something you get over. It was something you learn to carry like a stone in your pocket, sometimes heavy, sometimes smooth, but always there. He didn't preach resilience. He practiced it. Every morning he chose to get up, not because he felt like it, but because staying down wouldn't honor the people he'd lost. He showed up on set not to escape pain, but to build something meaningful in the middle of it. He treated every role, not as a chance to shine, but as a responsibility to tell a story well. And in doing so, he showed that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about continuing. People often asked how he stayed so grounded in a world that rewards ego. His answer was always the same in different words. Remember, you're just a person. He didn't say it with pride. He said it like a reminder, to himself as much as anyone. Fame, money, awards, they were temporary. But kindness, presence, integrity, those were the things that lasted. He believed that true strength wasn't in how loudly you declared your pain, but in how gently you treated others while carrying it. He'd seen people turn their trauma into weapons, blaming the world, demanding sympathy, using their past as an excuse to hurt others. He chose a different path. He let his pain soften him, not harden him. And that made all the difference. There's a moment that captures this perfectly. During a press tour for a film, a reporter asked, almost mockingly, "Why are you so quiet? Don't you have anything to say?" Most stars would have fired back with a joke or a jab. He paused, looked the reporter in the eye, and said softly, "Sometimes the most important things are the ones you don't say." Then he smiled, not to disarm, but to include. And the room went still. Not because he'd won an argument, but because he'd reminded everyone that silence can be full, not empty. That was his gift. He understood that not every feeling needs a platform. Not every wound needs an audience. Some things are meant to be held, not shared. And in a world that equates vulnerability with oversharing, that was a quiet rebellion. He also knew the difference between seeking help and seeking attention. He had close friends, real ones, who knew his darkest days. He talked to them, cried with them, sat in silence with them, but he never confused therapy with Twitter. He protected his healing process like a sacred space, not a content strategy. And in doing so, he modeled something powerful. You can be open with the people who matter without turning your life into a public spectacle. This wasn't about repression. It was about respect for himself and for others. He knew that dumping your emotional baggage on strangers, co-workers, or social media doesn't lighten the load. It just spreads the weight to people who aren't equipped to carry it. Real healing happens in safe spaces with trusted people over time. And until then, you keep going. You show up. You do your best, and his best wasn't flashy. It was in the small things. Saying good morning to the security guard. Remembering a crew member's child's name. Taking 5 minutes to listen when someone was struggling. These weren't grand gestures. They were daily acts of humanity. And over time, they added up to a life that meant something, not because of fame, but because of faithfulness. He also had a deep respect for work, not as a way to escape feelings, but as a form of dignity. Whether he was acting, building motorcycles, or helping a friend move, he gave his full attention. He believed that doing something well, anything, was a kind of prayer. And in a culture that glorifies hustle for the sake of status, he worked for the sake of care. This mindset shaped how he approached even his biggest roles. He didn't see acting as a chance to be admired. He saw it as a chance to connect, to tell stories that might help someone feel less alone. And he prepared relentlessly, not for awards, but for truth. He trained for months for fight scenes, not to look cool, but to honor the craft. He studied scripts like they were sacred texts, searching for the human heartbeat beneath the words. And when the cameras stopped rolling, he didn't switch off his humanity. He stayed present, asked how people were doing, made sure everyone had what they needed. On one film set, a young actor was nervous, fumbling lines, overwhelmed by the pressure. Instead of ignoring him or offering empty praise, he pulled him aside during a break. "You belong here," he said. "Just breathe. We're all figuring it out together." That moment didn't make headlines, but it changed that young actor's life. He never saw himself as a mentor, but he became one anyway, through action, not title. He led by example, not by lecture, and people followed, not because he told them to, but because they wanted to be more like him. What's striking isn't that he had all the answers. It's that he asked the right questions. Am I being kind? Am I showing up for the people who matter? Am I letting my pain make me bitter or better? These weren't philosophical puzzles. They were daily check-ins, and he held himself to them fiercely. He also understood that peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the presence of purpose. After everything he'd lost, he could have retreated, built walls, shut the world out, but he chose the opposite. He leaned in. He loved harder. He gave more. Not because he was fearless, but because he knew that connection was the only thing that made the weight bearable. And he never acted like his way was the only way. He didn't judge people for sharing their struggles online or seeking support publicly. He just lived his truth that for him, healing happened in quiet. And that was enough. There's a story from a small bookstore in New York. He was browsing poetry when a woman recognized him. She was hesitant but finally approached. She'd just lost her husband and said, "I don't know how to keep going." He didn't offer platitudes, didn't say everything happens for a reason. He just looked at her and said, "You don't have to know how. Just take the next step, then the next. That's enough." She later said those words got her through the week. That was his philosophy in a nutshell. Not grand, not perfect, just human, just true. And in a world that's always shouting about pain, about politics, about personal brands, his quiet way became a kind of anchor. People didn't follow him for his opinions. They followed him for his consistency, for the way he showed up day after day as someone kind, grounded, and real. He never called himself a role model, but he became one anyway, by refusing to perform, by choosing depth over drama, and by proving that you can be broken and still be whole. So when people now search for motivation or how to deal with loss, they often land on clips of him, even if he never gave a formal speech. Because his life is the message, and the message is this: don't tell others your problems to get sympathy. Solve them with courage, grow through them with grace, and let your actions, your kindness, your presence, your quiet strength speak louder than your pain ever could. Because in the end, the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people who show up, stay kind, and carry their load without making it everyone else's burden. And he's been doing that quietly for decades, without ever needing to say a word. Years passed and the world kept spinning, faster, louder, more connected than ever. Social media turned personal pain into public performance. Everyone had a story to tell, a wound to display, a brand to build from their brokenness. In that noise, something unexpected happened. People started sharing stories about him, not because he posted them, but because they couldn't forget them. A photo would surface. Him sitting alone on a subway bench, eyes tired but kind, holding a paper cup of coffee like any other commuter. Someone would write, "Saw him today. He gave up his seat for an elderly woman and didn't say a word." Another time, a fan posted a blurry picture from a gas station. "He paid for my gas when my card got declined. Told me, wait, we've all been there." These moments weren't staged. They weren't part of a PR campaign. They were just him, and they spread, not because he wanted them to, but because they reminded people of something they'd almost forgotten, that goodness still exists, quietly without needing credit. That was the strange twist of his life. He never tried to be an icon. He just tried to be a good person. And in doing so, he became something rare in the modern world, a symbol of quiet integrity. Not because he declared it, but because he lived it day after day, in ways no camera could fully capture. Strangers began calling him the internet's boyfriend, but not in the usual celebrity way. It wasn't about looks or charm. It was about the feeling he gave people, that maybe the world wasn't as cold as it seemed, that maybe there were still people who listened more than they spoke, who helped without expecting anything back, who carried their own pain without making it everyone else's problem. And the more the world shouted for attention, the more his silence spoke volumes. In an age where vulnerability is often weaponized for likes, his restraint became revolutionary. He proved you could be deeply human without turning your life into content. You could grieve without performing. You could heal without broadcasting. You could be famous and still choose humility. One of the most powerful things about him wasn't what he did. It was what he didn't do. He didn't monetize his trauma. He didn't write a tell-all memoir about his losses. He didn't launch a podcast dissecting his pain. He didn't use his platform to demand sympathy or build a following based on his suffering. Instead, he used his platform to lift others up, often without them even knowing it. There's a story from a small theater in Chicago. A local production was about to shut down, rent unpaid, actors unpaid, dreams slipping away. Out of nowhere, an anonymous donor covered all costs for the rest of the season. The director only found out it was him when, months later, they met at an event and he quietly said, "Art matters. Keep going. No fanfare. No photo op. Just support given freely." That was his pattern. He didn't wait for someone to ask. He saw a need and filled it, then walked away. And because he never claimed credit, the acts felt even more genuine. They weren't about him. They were about the people on the receiving end. And that's what made his influence ripple outward. It wasn't through speeches or slogans. It was through example, A young actor, inspired by how he treated crew members, started doing the same on their own sets. A fan, remembering how he once listened to her at a book signing, began volunteering at a shelter. A mechanic who'd once fixed his bike started mentoring at-risk teens because, if someone that kind can stay grounded, maybe I can too. His life became a quiet invitation. You don't have to be loud to matter. You don't have to share your pain to be seen. You just have to show up, be kind, and do the right thing, even when no one's watching. And in a world obsessed with image, that was deeply disarming. He also never stopped learning. Even in his 50s and beyond, he approached life with curiosity. He'd sit for hours in bookstores flipping through philosophy or poetry. He took up new hobbies, not to post about them, but because they brought him joy. He remained open, humble, willing to admit when he didn't know something. That humility made him relatable, not distant. People didn't worship him, they respected him. And that's a far rarer thing. He also never lost his sense of wonder. Despite everything he'd been through, the loss, the fame, the scrutiny, he still looked at the world with soft eyes. He'd stop to watch a sunset, smile at a dog, laugh at a silly joke. He hadn't let bitterness steal his joy. And that perhaps was his greatest act of rebellion. Because it's easy to become cynical after pain. Easy to close your heart, build walls, assume the worst in people. But he chose the harder path to stay open. To believe in kindness even when life gave him reasons not to. To keep giving even when he'd lost so much. And that choice inspired others to do the same. Online, people began sharing Keanu Reeves moments, and not just about him, but about times they chose kindness because of him. A man paid for a stranger's groceries and said, "Just passing on the Keanu energy." A woman stayed late to help a coworker and wrote, "Channeling my inner quiet hero." These weren't jokes. They were tributes to a way of living, one that said strength isn't in dominance but in gentleness. Success isn't in accumulation but in contribution. Even his return to the Matrix decades later wasn't about nostalgia or money. It was about finishing a story, honoring the people who'd been part of it, and reminding the world that some things like integrity, loyalty, and quiet courage never go out of style. And through it all, he remained the same. Still taking the subway, still remembering names, still giving more than he took, still carrying his past without letting it define his present. In the end, his legacy won't be measured in box office numbers or award statues. It'll be measured in the lives he touched without fanfare, in the gas station attendant who felt seen, the crew member who got a second chance, the grieving stranger who heard, "Just take the next step," and believed it. He never gave a formal motivational speech, but his life became one. Every choice, every act of kindness, every moment of quiet dignity added up to a message louder than any words. Don't tell others your problems to get attention. Solve them with grace. Grow through them with humility. And use what you've learned to make the world a little kinder for someone else. Because real strength isn't in how loudly you speak about your pain. It's in how gently you treat others while carrying it. And in a world that often confuses noise with value, the truth is more needed than ever. So when people now say, "What would he do?" they're not asking about a celebrity. They're asking about a standard, a quiet human standard of how to live with heart in a hard world. He didn't set out to be a role model. He just refused to lose his humanity. And in doing so, he gave others permission to hold on to theirs. No grand declarations, no viral moments. Just a lifetime of showing up, staying kind, and proving that the most powerful thing you can be in this world isn't famous, rich, or perfect, but simply, consistently, humanely good. And that, more than anything, is why his story continues to ripple, long after the cameras stop rolling, long after the headlines fade, long after the world moves on to the next big thing. Because kindness doesn't expire, presence doesn't trend, and a life lived with quiet integrity, that never goes out of style.